Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. Every month I try to pick my 5 favourite photos from the previous month. I think it's an exercise which has benefits for any photographer. Let's talk about my top 5 photos from last month, which is April 2026. In doing so, I want to talk about the cameras and lenses I used and draw any lessons I can from the photos. As always, please do give me a like and a subscribe if you enjoy the video. Photo 1. Photo 1 was taken on the east coast of Exuma in the Bahamas. We were due to take a boat trip later that day, which was conditional on the weather not being too dramatic. The sunrise was pretty dramatic, with plenty of wind and the clouds turning the sea, which is normally translucent, into a deep blue. An obvious point, but this photo demonstrates the benefits of using a zoom lens. I'm a recent convert to zoom lenses, having restricted myself to primes for many years. I shot this photo at 29mm, which was the focal length which enabled me to get the exact composition I wanted in camera. Sometimes you have to crop, but with the 12-100 I can avoid doing so far more than I would if I were using my normal bag of primes. The 12-100 is a great travel lens. It is on the bigger end of the micro four thirds lenses, but it is so versatile that it will justify its place in your camera bag. You can use it for portraits, cityscapes, wildlife and landscapes as here, and it performs really well at each of them. The combination of the EM5iii and the 12-100 makes a very convincing small one camera and lens combo for this type of trip. If we exclude some specialist subjects, in my case small lizards and birds, this camera and lens combination could have covered nearly all of the photography I did on this trip. Using the lens extended all the way at 100mm can be a bit ungainly to operate with one hand on the EM5iii, given the lack of grip on that camera, but it is usable, and at shorter focal lengths, for example 12mm for wide-angle landscapes, or 25mm, which is my go-to focal length for everyday portraits, it is fine. The optical quality of the 12-100 is incredible, and it takes very pleasing photos. Here I have zoomed into 1:1 to look at these trees, which are more than a kilometre away from where I'm standing to take the photo. Even shooting into the light, you can see the lens is sharp and contrasty. Photo 2. The boat trip did go ahead, and photo 2 was taken on Iguana Island, one of the Exuma Keys which is uninhabited except by scores of iguanas which are fed by the tourists and so are relatively tame and comfortable around humans. Shot at maximum focal length and wide open, I feel this shot really demonstrates the quality of the 12-100. Let's look at the colour and sharpness of the iguana's eye at 1:1. But even more than that, let's look at the way the lens falls off from the in-focus areas to the out-of-focus areas. It is a really pleasing lens in that way, it just takes lovely photos. The combination of the camera and the lens is weather sealed, which meant I had no hesitation taking it with me on the boat. I actually got soaked more than once on that trip while I was carrying the camera in my hands, but the camera and the lens were both fine. There is one limitation with the 12-100 which I would mention. Although it has a very close minimum focusing distance of 45cm at the telephoto end, and it is compatible with in-body focus stacking, it is not a substitute for macro lens or a proper telephoto wildlife lens. For larger lizards like this iguana, which was about the size of my leg, it is perfect. I also love the way it took these cat photos. But for smaller lizards, I found using either my Sigma 150mm f2.8 macro lens or my 300mm f4 Pro, which is what I use most of the time, was better. I've noticed that my Olympus 60mm f2.8 macro lens is far better for flower photos, mushrooms, and basically any photo of a small object close up. So although the 12-100 is a very versatile lens, it does have some limitations. Photo 3. We are back in England, now shooting with the OM1ii and the 300mm f4 with the teleconverter. This juvenile muntjac deer and I were checking each other out. I don't think these deer have the best eyesight, and so I'm sure that I had a much better view of it through my lens than it had of me. This photo was taken with the OM1ii using bird subject detect. In theory, I should have switched to dogs and cats subject detect for the deer, and for a trickier deer which was further away, that might have been necessary. But in general, I use the bird subject detect for nearly every animal which is not a human, and the camera seems to handle this very well. I'm shooting at 1/100th of a second, which is slower than I typically shoot for wildlife, and in particular with 300mm with the teleconverter. However, the image stabilization in the lens, combined with the in-body image stabilization, does a really good job, and seeing how sharp this shot is makes me think I should not hesitate to dip my shutter speeds in future if I need to do so. The RAW file for this photo has gone through DxO PureRaw. This is for sharpening in this case, as there would not have been much, if any, noise in the shot. OM System make a number of telephoto lenses, and some of them are very impressive. However, I'm not sure that any of them have bokeh which is quite as pleasing as the 300mm f4 Pro. Even the FROK, which is my term for bokeh which is in front of the subject, is very nice. Photo 4. I had to do without my OM1ii for a couple of weeks at the end of the month, as I managed to knock the camera by accident and damage the buttons on the top left shoulder panel. Before this happened, I'd struggled to think of what would make me leave the OM1ii behind and take up my old EM1iii again, and I had dreaded doing so. However, in practice, I found that going back to the EM1iii was not too painful. The poor EVF in the EM1iii is the most obvious downgrade. I got used to that again somewhat, but I found I did actually miss some shots due to not being able to see properly using the EM1iii EVF. The lack of subject detection modes on the EM1iii is also an impediment. Once you get used to the camera finding and tracking the subject in the EVF for you, it is difficult to get used to tracking it again manually using the AF joystick. This does result in more photos with a centrally placed subject, although I think that it does actually work well in this case. The image quality of the OM1ii and the EM1iii is very similar, and I would struggle to tell photos from the two cameras apart. However, there is no doubt that the OM1ii is better at high ISOs. I also have a suspicion, although no hard evidence to back it up, that there is a slight difference in the image quality of the two sensors. It seems like the OM1ii is ever so slightly more clinical, more clean and more digital, whereas the EM1iii is slightly softer and more filmic. That is definitely the impression you would get looking through the two viewfinders. I think this photo and the previous photo would support that view, although as each photo has been processed differently, one can't draw any scientific conclusions. I think the soft glow in this photo suits the orange tip butterfly. I have done a series of videos comparing the OM1ii and the EM1iii in detail, so if you are interested in that comparison, I suggest you check those out. Photo 5. I like wrens. They do tend to test the camera and the photographer as they are such tiny birds. Using the EM1iii in continuous autofocus mode, I found it is not terrible for bird photography, even without a subject detect mode. It does just take a bit of getting used to, going back to a more manual approach. Nowadays, I use OM Workspace to process my photos almost exclusively, apart from the fact that I use DxO PureRaw for noise reduction and sharpening. DxO does an incredible job on those fronts, but one thing it does not do is preserve the beautiful Olympus colours. Only OM Workspace does that. So for photos that I like, I will generally run the RAW file through DxO, and also through the AI noise reduction and unsharp mask on OM Workspace, and then see which result I like better. In this shot, I have used the DxO file and tried to match the OM colours, but it is not a 100% match. OM Workspace is free, and I find that although it has some limitations, it is an incredibly useful and powerful piece of software. In particular, the AI noise reduction for a free piece of software has no business being as good as it is, and I'm getting better at coaxing detail out with the unsharp mask setting. If you have an Olympus or OM System camera, it is worth giving OM Workspace a try, not least because it will enable you to keep the lovely Olympus colours in your photos. Well, that's the video, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting. Please do give me a like and a subscribe, and if you've got any comments or queries, please drop them down below. As I say, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I will catch you on the next one. Goodbye.